Good afternoon from London. Good morning in Boston. Good evening to those of you who are joining us from Asia. We have a very big audience today. My name is Erik Berglof. I'm the director of the LSE Institute of Global Affairs at the LSE School of Public Policy. You're most welcome to this webinar on shrinking capitalism. This is part of a series on COVID-19 and early lessons from the pandemic we are organizing with the CEPR and the LSE School of Public Policy. Today's session is quite different from previous sessions in this series. It is centered around a short paper, just 9 pages, with the same short title as we have chosen for this session, Shrinking Capitalism. The paper was written by Samuel Bowles and Wendy Carlin, who are both participating in today's panel. The paper has no formulas and only one very simple figure, yet it's extremely rich, summarizing a century of economic thought and distilling the view of society from some recent developments, particularly in incomplete contracting and behavioral economics. The authors apply it to help us understand important institutions in the modern economy, but also to develop a vision of a better society. It is not easy to discuss such a complex and compact paper in a very short panel session like this. And I'm very grateful to the authors for accepting this limiting format to discuss these deep and complex ideas. The real world has many very different forms of capitalism. There's a whole literature that deals with varieties of capitalism within Europe and globally. David Soskice on this panel has been one of the main contributors to this literature. Of course, capitalism has become more common in the world, but the spectrum has also widened, particularly with the emergence of Asia. And state capitalism has made inroads in many parts of the world. The Shrinking Capitalism paper could help us understand these differences. But perhaps even more importantly, Sam and Wendy have a normative ambition. They want to build a better society, a more inclusive, more democratic, and more sustainable society with stronger ethical foundations. Of course, the idea of such a society is not new, and the notion that we need to have more complex models than just market and state has of course been around for quite some time. And of course, some of these ideas have also penetrated some of the most conservative bastions of economics. Take, for example, the way we teach corporate finance today is very different from how I used to teach it 10 to 15 years ago. But I think what is new here is that the conceptual foundations are stronger, and the authors hold out the prospect of a more coherent framework for understanding much more complex real-world societies than those featured in our model. So what does all this have to do with COVID-19? Of course, the paper was written, I presume, or I know, it was written before COVID-19 was first discovered in November, December last year. But it's probably fair to say that the pandemic has changed many things. Some see this as an opportunity to building back better. And maybe it's also an opportunity to build back society better. COVID-19 also raises many important ethical issues, and the shrinking capitalism may even tell us how to best organize our attack against the virus. Perhaps the military terminology that is so common in this discussion is misleading when we think about how to address a pandemic. So we have a fantastic panel today that will allow us to discuss all these issues. I will introduce them as they speak, and Sam and Wendy will present the paper, and then David Soskice will relate it, I think, to his earlier work, and then Philippe Aghion will present some related work that's inspired by their paper. Before I let the speakers in, just we have a very big audience. We have more than 700 people signed up for this session, and we want to try to make it interactive, but of course the presentations will proceed, and you will have a chance to ask questions using the Q&A or the chat room. We will then, those who want to ask questions could either just post them on the Q&A, but they can also raise their hand, and they use the raise hand function in Zoom. For those of you who are watching the live stream on Facebook, you should just use the comment function, and we'll try to pick up some of those questions as well. So without further ado, can I hand over to Wendy Carlin, professor at the University College London. And I should have said they, together with Sam and a few others, but particularly with Sam, they are also initiators of a very innovative way of teaching economics, the core model. We won't have time to talk about that today, but I think this is a very important part of their contribution to economics. So please, Wendy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Erik, and I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. So I'm going to share my screen. So thank you, everyone, and let's head into the talk. The battle for the post-COVID-19 narrative is already underway, and you can see that by looking at this quote from The Economist editorial board. Big government is needed to fight the pandemic. What matters is how it shrinks back again afterwards. A pandemic government is not fit for everyday life. The FT took a rather different view, saying that radical reforms will need to be put on the table. Government will have to accept a more active role in the economy, and policies until recently considered eccentric, such as basic income and wealth taxes, will have to be in the mix. What we're going to set out in our talk is that there's a chance for a new narrative to emerge that will bring in a third pole, community or civil society, that will expand the space for policies by drawing on ethical motivations of solidarity and duty that go beyond material gain and compliance with governmental fiat. And the FT article here is the one that I referred to, and you can see that what we've got here are volunteers pulling carts of food donations in London in the pandemic. We've seen something else in the pandemic, which is that prices cannot do the work of morals. So you've got this official statement from the UK Department of Education of who is an essential worker. So the question of who is an essential worker has become crucial during the pandemic. And you can see here that many of those identified in that way are among the lowest paid. What we've also seen is that ethical, generous and trusting norms have been successful and seen variation across countries in anti-pandemic responses, and that these are absent often from the conventional economics paradigm. There's going to be a lot of words in this talk, so let's clear up some of the meanings. I've been talking about a narrative, which is like a story, a particular way of explaining or understanding events. And as an example, think of a social democratic or New Deal narrative. Like the Great Depression occurred because workers weren't paid enough to buy all the goods produced. It ended because of war-induced deficit spending by the government. And then the golden age of capitalism that followed was sustained by the spending of high-wage trade union workers and the welfare state. So that's an example of a narrative. Vernacular is an everyday way of talking. So a neoliberal vernacular might be something like, there's no such thing as society, or labor unions are just special interest groups. We're also going to be talking about a policy paradigm, and we think of that as comprising 4 mutually reinforcing levels. So at the base, there are ethical commitments, the normative foundations of the paradigm. Then there's an economic model, emblematic policies which implement the ethical commitments using insights from the economic model. And then the way it's talked about is in terms of everyday language or a vernacular. So taking classical liberalism, we can think of the value of equal dignity, the model of the division of labor, specialization, comparative advantage, the policies like the repeal of the Corn Laws, and then as Alice said to the Queen, it's all done by everyone minding their own business. And we think this new narrative will not be limited to the government markets continuum. But what do we mean by that? We're talking here about these 2 poles here. At one end is government, and at the other end is markets. And the notion of a pole or a node refers to both the institution or the rule of the game, as we would think about it, the rules of the game, but also to the motivations and social norms that make those rules work well. So take some policies like carbon tax and dividend and cap and trade. What they do is they use the complementarity or the synergy of state capacity and market mechanisms, but they weight them differently in pursuit of the same goal. Narratives have changed before. I've already talked about the Great Depression and the Second World War, so we can see the move from classical liberalism and the neoclassical economics of the 19th and early 20th century to the post-Depression New Deal social democratic narrative and underpinnings of Keynesian economics. It's interesting what this very famous quote from FDR, he says, heedless self-interest is bad economics. So he's relating the norms and the economic model and an outcome in the world. And the vernacular of the new model was is also captured by the way we teach our students, as Erik referred to at the beginning. And at this time, the new paradigm was encapsulated in Paul Samuelson's famous 1948 textbook. So climate change and COVID-19 present us with the opportunity for a similar shift. So just to summarize, state capacity and market signals remain absolutely essential in any new paradigm, but they're insufficient. The one-dimensional continuum presumes that private and governmental actors have sufficient information to design mechanisms, some combination of contracts and regulations, that are adequate to address global pandemics and climate change and other big problems with which we're confronted. It overlooks the social character of people, which provides opportunities for solutions along a third dimension complementary to governments and markets, and it ignores the informational and behavioral revolutions in economics. As a result, it abstracts from the important role of social norms and of the private exercise of power and social goals that go beyond liberty and shared affluence.
Now, it's true that the policy paradigm and the debate about policy has been really locked onto that single dimensional perspective, but economics has not. If you look at the last 4 decades of economic research, we've really gone way ahead. For example, I think that mechanism design has taught us that good laws and good incentives are no substitute for good citizens. And by this, I mean, no matter how cleverly you design a mechanism, whatever it is, whether it's market signals or government fiats or some combination, they can backfire, and at the very least, they won't be sufficient to address our challenges, particularly challenges of the scope of the pandemic or climate change. I think we've also learned that from behavioral economics, that there are plenty of good citizens. They're not scarce. We've seen this, we know it from our experiments, we've seen it dramatically in the past couple of months as people struggle with this crisis with tremendous generosity and trust and solidarity. But there's also a warning here, and that is that when people care about others, they sometimes care negatively. Altruism is there, reciprocity as well, but also hostility towards outsiders. We hear repeatedly the President of the United States referring to the Chinese virus. Let's remember that we're hoping that cooperation will be an outcome of this crisis, but tribalism is equally possible. Now, tribalism has been one of the unpleasant surprises that we've experienced in the US, UK, and other countries around the world. So let's think about where we went wrong or why we were surprised. Well, Wendy and I think that we've missed the boat somewhat because economists, don't talk about a lot of things that people really care about a lot, like identity, community, autonomy, dignity. Now, economics is not to be faulted there either, or at least not entirely so. Just go back to the Wealth of Nations. No, not the Theory of Moral Sentiments, the Wealth of Nations. Here you have from my undergraduate textbook where I've beautifully underlined It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their self-interest. Now, this is usually quoted as an example of how Smith was saying that the pursuit of self-interest leads to efficient results. Read on. The part that I did not underline as an undergraduate goes on to say, nobody but a beggar chooses to depend chiefly upon the benevolence of his fellow citizens. Well, why was he saying that? He was saying that because to Adam Smith, market exchanges are a way of democratizing dignity, ensuring equal dignity through exchanges among people who do not have to rely on the benevolence of others. It was a dignity point he was making there. Now, let's think about what we can learn from other paradigms. When we think of a paradigm, a successful one, it has normative foundations, it has an economic model, it has emblematic policies, as Wendy said, it has vernacular economics. Wendy and I put together a huge table, you can see how big it must be, in which we fill in the blanks for classical liberalism and so on. But let's just talk about the neoliberal paradigm here. In the normative foundations, we have some notion of negative liberty, a limited notion of freedom, procedural justice. The economic model is well known, self-interest, not only in markets, but also government officials. Then they added to that, and this is where they were a huge success. There were some emblematic policies, school vouchers in the United States, negative income tax. And then the vernacular was also a very popular and successful thing. The government that governs best, governs least, labor unions or special interest groups, and so on. Now, I think we can learn from them. The first thing that is obvious that they did was they unified a philosophy with economics. So their ethics and their economic ideas were integrated. Beyond that, they did some good economics. They contributed substantially to our economic theory. So you had, for example, Hayek on the nature of equilibrium and the competitive process, Buchanan on public choice, Friedman on the limits of the Keynesian model, Becker's work on interest groups. No one says that these are not major contributions to economics. And I think that if you think that the neoliberal paradigm won because they essentially had the right-wing think tanks and so on, think again. They actually developed some economic theories which actually had some credibility along with their philosophical orientation. Now, let's think about a challenge to that. I think we can start by just start with the fact that liberty, fairness, and efficiency are valuable goals, but they're not the sole ethical standards for evaluating economic outcomes. The idea that we can restrict ourselves to those limited objectives really stems from a development within economic theory and what I call an outmoded but very influential view of the exchange process. And this is that exchange, economic interactions, can be defined as a morality-free zone. Listen to David Gautier, the philosopher, a very important statement. The presumption of free activity in markets ensures that no one is subject to any form of compulsion or to any limitation not already affecting her actions as a solitary individual. Thus, morality has no application to market interactions under the conditions of perfect competition. A remarkable statement. Now, you think, well, Gautier, a philosopher, it comes from also Kenneth Arrow, a certainly left of center economist. Arrow said, any complaints about the market's operation can be reduced to complaints about the distribution of income. The price system itself determines the distribution only in the sense of preserving the status quo. So the market is once again exculpated. Now, what this says, following from Arrow, is that aside from concerns about distributive justice, prices will do the work of morals. That's the message. Now, okay. Prices will do the work of morals. These are women in a meatpacking company in the United States. Some are infected. Some will bring home infections to their family. They'll infect each other. They were required to go to work, in many cases against their will. Their employer, who has a contract with them, has the authority to command that they actually work under those conditions, risking their lives and the lives of others. Many people look at this and they say, wow, Is that what you get in an exchange? You get the ability to order people to risk their life and risk the lives of others? Some think that violates democratic norms. Some think it violates libertarian norms. Concerns of this nature are absent from the economics paradigm. They only become obvious when you take the limited information paradigm, referring to Hayek. Actually, Herbert Simon and Coase were the first to develop these ideas. But now let's think about the disappearance of power in economics. There was a time when economists knew, or at least some economists knew, that power was what economics was all about in terms of the labor contract. Coase famously said the nature of the contract with the worker is that for a certain remuneration, he agrees to obey the directions of the entrepreneur. So this is a contract of obedience, obviously a political statement. How did that disappear from economics? It disappeared because we came to assume that all of the contracts that we're interested in are complete. And then Oliver Hart says, quite rightly, what does it mean to put someone in charge of an action or a decision if all actions are specified in a contract? Well, that was it. Power disappeared. Now, an important and complementary development in the theory is that not only does it disappear in the sense that Hart says, but because when you have complete contracts, the Nash equilibrium of the interaction will be market clearing. It follows from that nobody would worry about their contract being terminated because their next best alternative is equivalent to their current one. That's what a clearing market means. And so the complete contracts and market clearing was a method by which power was purged from economics. Now, that then becomes part of the vernacular. Listen to Aghion and Allen, an important textbook of half a century ago. One could call the employee the boss because he orders the employee to pay him a specific sum if he wants his services performed, but words are words. So the idea is now going to be part of how we talk about the boss. It's just a word. Now, think about the political consequences of adopting this vernacular. Think about, for example, advocating workers' political rights in the workplace. If the vernacular is, well, we could call the worker the boss or the boss the worker, it doesn't matter. Well, it would become as difficult to advocate workers' rights as it would have been to advocate unemployment insurance or any of the other automatic stabilizers had the concept of aggregate demand not become part of our everyday conversation in economics. Or for that matter, advocating a libertarian stance towards government in the absence of the perfectly competitive neoclassical model, supporting the idea of Adam Smith's invisible hand. Now, the view of this view of the economy and the exchange process, which purged power from economics, came to dominate what we call economics mid-century, the last century. Here is Abba Lerner, quite rightly defining economics as success in this respect. An economic transaction, he meant a contract, is a solved political problem, very important, a solved political problem. Economics has gained the title Queen of the Social Sciences by choosing solved political problems as its domain. The effect of this is, of course, to exclude any political relations within economics from our view. Now, in the real economy, the domain of complete contracts was never very large. It included, for example, labor markets, credit markets, and so on. And however large that domain was at the time when Abba Lerner wrote, it's getting smaller now as the economy shifts out of the production of things and into the production of services, care, knowledge, production, leisure services, and so on. Now, we know now in economics a lot of things about what happens when the contract is not complete. There is a principal, for example, the lender, the employer, and there's a borrower, the worker, there's an agent, borrower or worker. The first thing we know from this literature is that the principal exercises power over the agent. Second, power can be abused at minor cost or no cost in the limit to the principal, such as sexual harassment, mini aggressions, and so on. Third is that things like truth-telling, work ethic, intrinsic motivation, reciprocity become essential to the sustaining an exchange. And then the fourth, the allocations are Pareto inefficient. I don't think any of these statements is controversial among people who are doing work in the theory of principal agent models applied to these contracts. Now, there are important ideological and political consequences. So, for example, if you recognize that the principle has power, then you may ask, well, shouldn't that power be accountable? What about those women working in the meatpacking factory? Shouldn't they have had a voice in that decision? We typically think that life and death power is something that should be accountable typically by democratic or libertarian means. The fact that the power can be abused at limited cost to the principle means that perhaps we should talk about an expansion of individual rights to enhance dignity and equal status. If social norms are important, then we'd better try to design a society in which norms of reciprocity and work ethic and so on can thrive. And that means essentially challenging inequality, because you can never have strong notions of reciprocity, altruism towards other, with vast differences in economic standing. And finally, the fact that the Nash equilibrium of those relations, those economic relationships, are Pareto inefficient means that the above demands that I just mentioned, all of them can be pursued in ways which will make the economy work better for everybody. That is partially correcting the Pareto inefficiencies that exist above. Now, so let's think about a new paradigm. Successful paradigms in the past, the ones we've mentioned, have performed really a remarkable thing. They've combined a set of ethical values with a model of how the economy works. And a property of that model is that the pursuit of the ethical values contributes to the performance of the economy. That's really that's a profound achievement of, for example, the neoliberals, the Keynesians and so on, and the classical liberals. Now, one of the problems is this. You not only need to have that thing work together, the model of the economy has to be sufficiently accurate for what the economy is like, so that actually policies which are introduced on that paradigm will work well enough to deliver concrete benefits to the participants in the society.
So let's think about what the foundations might be of a new paradigm. And what we're going to talk about is this third pole. So the idea is that the elements of the new theory have to take into account the limits of private contract and governmental fiat, with this new view of what people are actually like. So this is the image, this is the model, and you can see the expanded space that's created by bringing in this third pole of civil society. A number of different policies are represented in there, but what's interesting in the context of this discussion today is that the COVID-19 crisis provided us with a kind of a test for thinking about this framework. And you can see here we've got all kinds of different actions that have been characteristic of the crisis, including right at the government pole, the government stepping in as insurer of last resort on a really massive scale around the world. So the government, the market poles are there, but much of the explanation of different successes across different societies have come from what's not on the blue line, and from the role of social norms, for example, of truth-telling, of trust in political leaders, trust in scientists, that are captured by many of these the different responses captured here. So from virus testing and tracing in South Korea, which clearly required huge willingness of the population to submit to that. The NHS call for volunteers, right? They put out a call for 250,000 volunteers, and they had to say stop after 5 days because they had 750,000. They're just examples. And today is the meeting of the Vaccine Alliance organized out of London. And this is another very good example of why we need to include this expanded space if we're going to accomplish the kind of policy changes that are required to combat threats like global pandemics and also climate change. On that note, we should take our lead from Mark Carney, who says, well, we can't self-isolate from climate change. And also to highlight, if we're thinking about the vernacular and what's in the air, what people are thinking about, then take a look at this. This is data from asking students what they think the most pressing issue economists should be addressing. And here we see just one example of this, where inequality, climate change, environment, the future of work, all these major problems are being thrown up by students. That's what they want to talk about. And we can, with the economic foundations that Sam has presented, we can step up and help to construct a new paradigm. So that's the paper that Erik referred to, and I'll finish there.
I'd like to add, there's a chat asked, would the slides be made available to everyone? And we're very happy to make our slides available. We'll give them to you, Erik, and you can post them in some way.
And that's just the advertising break.
Yeah.
I'll stop the screen share now.
And the collaboration between Wendy and Sam was so seamless, so I never had a chance to introduce Sam. But so Samuel Bowles is used to be at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, but is now deputy director of the Santa Fe Institute, one of the sources of many creative ideas in economics. His book, The Moral Economy, you also know quite well, I think. So David Soskice is LSE school professor of economics and political science, and you have studied many different forms of capitalism, and what are your reflections on this shrinking capitalism?
Well, thanks very much. So I'm very attracted by the argument which Sam Bowles and Wendy Carlin are making. I'm not quite sure whether shrinking would be the right word. I'm not quite sure that's the dimension I'd be thinking about, but leave that on one side. This is an argument which I think is a fabulous argument. And it's certainly the case that in the knowledge economy world, which I'm really working on at the moment, most of the things we engage in with others are parts of incomplete contracts. And therefore, I believe very strongly that social norms, truth-telling, work ethic, and so on, can play a major role in resolving how people behave in such situations in more efficient ways than the standard principal agent models used to teach us. It's an attractive idea that, thinking of the development of capitalism in the knowledge economy, that social norms should play a major role in improving outcomes, reducing surveillance, guard labor. Thanks very much, Sam, for that marvelous phrase, guard labor, and enabling more open-ended relations. Needless to say, I don't dissent from any of that. But I think in one respect, I want to take a more radical view. In working on the knowledge economy, as well as on more generally on high-level services, including health and education, I'm very struck by the role which personal relationships within the workforce, including managers, play in the way in which work works. And personal relationships go further than social norms. Indeed, personal relationships often underpin social norms. I think a lot of social science literature has perhaps neglected the role of personal relationships in economic life and in the workplace. So I see personal relations more important than social norms by themselves at solving incomplete contracts. Personal relations develop through interaction between individuals in the workplace over time. They typically require a history of personal interaction. One acquires a reputation of reliability through working with others, and it typically involves the promise of future interaction or work together. And I believe we are moving to a world in which interpersonal relations govern an increasing amount of high-level work between highly educated people. Richard Florida's famous creative class phrase. Indeed, if we ask at the moment why, this seems a very pertinent question to ask in the coronavirus world, if we ask about why face-to-face working environments, face-to-face working over extended periods in innovative and high value-added activities, why that seems so important to work face-to-face instead of over Zoom, it has much to do with cultivating good and reliable and ongoing relations with other people. If we never met, think about this is worrying if no vaccine is invented. If we never met co-workers except via Zoom, it's not at all clear that we would at all be able to build up similar relations of trust. This, of course, has actually got a lot to do with the role of friendship in making society work. Now, I think that as social scientists, particularly as economists, we've really neglected the concept of friendship in the way in which society works. Obviously, a lot to do with centrality of family as well. But if we do push this question of where does advanced capitalism go, can we talk about tying personal relationships into an effective model of an economy? And I'm very, I very much like Sam and Wendy's whole agenda of thinking about how do we build a more inclusive capitalist society. And I'm talking really, I've become really a bit obsessed about advanced capitalism being based on a highly educated workforce. And currently in the UK, we are in, I would say, a pretty crazy situation. We have a highly segregated workforce as far as education is concerned. In this country, half young people go to university, half don't. Actually, more than half women go to university and less than half men. Now, this is a vast subject. Where do we go from here? But one aspect is this. If we want a more inclusive social economy, my view, my view is we need to work out in the long term a way to get a very much higher proportion of people in higher education, with a corresponding increase in graduate jobs, at the same time raising the status and rewards of education, health, and also care, because in my view, care should be thought of as a serious profession, and people should go to higher education to get the qualifications for becoming serious care workers. So we need to get a corresponding increase in graduate jobs And we need at the same time to raise the status and rewards of education, health, and care. So I see that an advanced economy very much based on a much more expanded idea of a highly educated workforce. I see that as the way to raise a proportion of work environments with stronger personal relations, and stronger personal relations, in my view, underpinning social norms, in which principal-agent models no longer resolve incomplete contracts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Certainly food for thought there, and I'll let Sam and Wendy come back later. The last speaker is Philippe Aghion. I think he's known to most of you, professor at Collège de France, and we are very proud to have him as part of our faculty at LSE as well. Philippe is probably the main contributor to the new neo-Schumpeterian theory of economic growth and innovation. He has also spent a lot of time trying to see how different institutions work together or don't work together in terms of promoting economic growth and innovation. So Philippe, I know you've been working on related work, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So first I want to congratulate really Sam and Wendy. I think this work is been for me very much inspirational. I think it's really this representation, this triangle between markets, state, and civil society, I think is illuminating. I think, being Schumpeterian, you believe in the market because that's where you need firms with incentives to innovate. So that's where the market is, and you need entry, you need turnover. That's the enterprise sector. So that's the market. But we also know that firms will tend to underinvest in research or and you need the state to both invest and also insure. We know that, for example, when you have the COVID crisis, you need the state as an insurer. You need the state to insure workers against the risk of losing jobs. So that's where you need the role of the state. So the third, so you need the state as an insurer and an investor. Let me close the door because then otherwise I cannot be. Voilà. But that's not enough. You need also civil society. Why do you need civil society? You need civil society because there is always the risk that the state would collude with incumbent firms to prevent new entry. There is the risk more generally of abuse of power by the state, and that's where civil society has an important role to play. So already if you are in the Schumpeterian world, civil society comes in right away. You need civil society not only to complete contracts, but to also enforce contracts. And let me give you an example. In France, in the 1958 constitution, we had the possibility to seize the equivalent of the Supreme Court. We call that the Conseil constitutionnel. You see, when you think that something is not constitutional, you could in principle, appeal to that court. But early on, only the head of the Senate and the head of the chamber could do it. And in fact, de facto, it would never happen. And so after 1968 and the movement of 1968, Giscard d'Estaing, because he wanted to avoid a new 1968, decided to enlarge the possibility to seize the constitutional court. And then it became seized many times. So that means it was, initially it was something completely formal, without any economic content. And without 1968, there would have never have been any content to the legal possibility to seize the Supreme Court. So that's a kind of illustration of the role that civil society can do, not only to complete the contract, but to enforce the contract. And so that's something I wanted to mention. This is about capitalism. I think I don't want to redo the presentation I did last week, but one thing is that COVID is a wake-up call to rethink our capitalist system. And there are various issues, and I think the big winner there was Germany. Germany does very well on value chains. Germany does very well on social and health insurance. And Germany does very well when it comes to civil society and trust compared to France or compared to the US. I don't want to be too long. On value chain, let me show you for the products which I call COVID products, pharmaceutical, medical instruments, protection. Here is France and Germany. You see the dotted lines are France. That's the imports and exports of those products. And look, Germany. Germany is a big exporter and a big importer. In the early 2000s, France and Germany were the same. And now the huge gap between Germany is a net exporter by 20 billion euros of these COVID products. And that's very important to know because it helped Germany manage the crisis much better than France. We didn't have respirators in France, only 5,000 beds with respirators. They had 25,000 beds with respirators in Germany. They had tests, we didn't have tests. They had masks, we didn't have masks. That's why we had to close the economy for 2 months with enormous economic costs in France. Germany didn't go through that, okay? So very good Germany, very bad France, okay? That's first number one. Let me look at something else now. Let me look at the social system. Okay, so let me look at the social system. And the social system is this social and health insurance. That's current work I'm doing with André Sapir and a student of mine called Hélène Maghion. Okay, so if you look there, you see, you can see, I will show you data on unemployment and health coverage. So this is the lines, this is the health insurance. Those are the fraction of people in Germany without health insurance. It's 0. Everybody in Germany has health insurance. That's the unemployment in Germany. It went up a little bit with, can you see my mouse, Erik?
Yep.
Unemployment went up by just a little bit with the COVID in Germany. This is unemployment going up a lot in the US. And this is the fraction of people, dotted line, without health insurance. It goes up a lot. So you see the superiority of the German system, of the German capitalism over the US capitalism. US capitalism, you lose your employment and you lose also health access. So that's and the comparison between US and Germany, I could do between US and other European countries. European countries looks much more like Germany than of course like the US. I talk about health coverage, I could talk about risk of poverty. Same things there. If you look at the risk of getting poverty, the risk of poverty, Germany is here. You see, barely goes up. And that's the risk of falling into poverty in the US following the COVID. Enormous increase. So there is something wrong with the US system when it comes to social protection, whereas Germany does much better. And the last one, I want to, then I come to exactly Wendy, is civil society and trust. So of course, Wendy and Sam is the primary reference. There is also some related work by Acemoglu Robinson on civil society and the state, but they miss the market part, and I'm doing something currently myself. So this is just reproducing Sam and Wendy, okay? And that's the thing, and it's very interesting how they show that there are two applications. One is COVID, another one is the environment. I think that if you rely on civil society, you can also improve the environment. In recent work with Roland Benabou, I showed that in societies where there is a demand for green innovation and for environment, the consumers can play a big role in forcing firms to innovate green. So again, there, civil society, but there's been also work by Hart and Zingales and by Benabou and Tirol about corporate social responsibility, showing again there the role that civil society can play in pushing firms to innovate greener. At the time where we had the yellow vest in France, and we know the limits of relying only on the carbon tax. I am not against the carbon tax, but you should look for other more imaginative instruments. And certainly the pressure you can have from consumers and from shareholders with corporate social responsibility is, I think, a big lever of imposing greener innovation. One thing which I wanted to end up with, Erik, is the fact I had done some work previously with Schleifer, Cahuc, and Aghion, looking at the link between regulation and distrust. France is a country where you regulate a lot. And as a result, the private agents don't invest in trust. And therefore, you have the bad equilibrium where and it was true during COVID. What happened during the confinement? I had a policeman in every corner in Paris checking on people, you see, and therefore people were cheating. So in France, it's a country where the policeman verbalizes everyone, and when everybody tries to cheat the system. And Germany is a place where you don't verbalize, and people don't try to cheat as much. And you see, it's a vicious circle. When there is a lot of regulation, people distrust and they cheat. But because they distrust and cheat, there is a demand for regulation. And that reproduces that bad equilibrium. You want to move from an equilibrium like this. You want to move from an equilibrium. France is very much at the north-east of this graph. And you would like to move to an equilibrium which is at the southwest of this graph, you see. So you have various measures of regulation and distrust, where you always see that when you have more regulation, you have more distrust in all dimensions. And
Philippe, I think.
I don't want to go too much. I'm done. I just wanted to say that I was very much inspired by Sam and Wendy, and that the COVID is a wake-up call to rethink capitalism, more social systems in the US, and more decentralized and trusting more civil society in France. Thank you. Sorry for being long.
Thank you very much, Philippe. And so I'm very conscious now of getting the audience a chance to come in, but I also want to give Sam and Wendy a chance to comment on what was said here. But I let a few questions in. So there are, of course, a lot of questions on the Q&A function here. Maybe. So there are a couple of questions about Germany, maybe inspired by Philippe, but also definitely by the shrinking capitalism model. This is from Saskia Helm. In this last slide, explaining the new paradigm, you mentioned as well the German healthcare system. Could you explain more in detail why? Christian Kettles says, thank you for the presentation. Could the concept of a social market economy that emerged in Germany after World War II be a source of inspiration for the new framework needed? Shall we start with sort of the comments that Philippe made about Germany, the comments, I know, Wendy, you have worked a lot on Germany as a system.
As has David.
As has David, of course, definitely so.
Yeah, so there were very good questions and stimulated by Philippe's very powerful charts. So I think that one of the kind of the big questions that's been thrown up by COVID, you know, we get a shock that's the same shock. You know, someone arrives into a country and we can observe, it's like an experiment. This person number one arrives in each of these European countries, and we can trace the consequences. So it's a very, very unusual opportunity to see these different systems in play. And in some ways, you know, there's a bit too much of a good thing. There are too many possible dimensions of the German system that have contributed to its very different outcome. So yes, we have many dimensions of not only the German healthcare system, but the German system of Kurzarbeit that has limited the increase in unemployment. There are definitely combinations that are sitting inside that triangle, and they partly work because of also of decentralization at the state level. So that then makes it much easier to form effective responses, combining non-governmental and non-market institutions. For example, in the testing response in Germany, so mobilization at a much deeper level across the country than was the case, for example, in the UK, which many people thought the UK had these fantastic advantages going into this crisis of the NHS, but the centralized control prove to be a disadvantage. So let me stop there.
I just want to say one thing which gets neglected in this discussion of Germany, and that's the role of works councils in plants. So you have a system of industrial democracy at very low levels in Germany. It's very well resourced and it's very thoughtful about exactly these sorts of situations.
There's a question here also, something we may have forgotten about, but it's from Patrick Carter. Do you have any reflections on the fate of David Cameron's Big Society? So this seems like a long time ago, but anyone who wants to, how does that fit into?
I think one of the things which has been absolutely shown up is that we are such a highly centralized society, and centralization goes in the opposite direction to the big society. And despite all the business about mayoral elections and so on of different regions in this country, it has had a very, very limited effect because the government of Whitehall has been really unprepared to really seriously give resources to the different regions, which would have made a big difference actually in this situation.
Erik, if I might, I'd like to say something in response to both David and Philippe. Thank you for your fantastic comments. David, I was very struck by your emphasis on personal relationships. And you probably know this, but others don't. That critique of the neoclassical or Walrasian model, it was most powerfully put forward by Hayek. In a 1948 paper, Hayek said, especially remarkable is the explicit and complete exclusion from the theory of perfect competition of all personal relationships existing between the parties. That's Hayek. And once again, Hayek had it right. His economics, I'm talking about, of course. Philippe, your stuff on crowding out is really fantastic. And it's an important, I mean, obviously we know there's experimental evidence and so on. There's some, I recently saw some evidence from Germany, for example, that in the face of policies for wearing masks, a tracing app on your telephone, getting a vaccine, in these cases, a number of anti-COVID policies, people were much more willing to comply with them if they were voluntary than if they were enforced. And so that means something very important. It means that the enforcement and the social preferences that both could contribute to people adopting the policies, they're non-additive. And it's very important we take it on board. That is, these can be, we could design incentives, material incentives and enforce incentives, which would be complementary to social preferences, but by and large, we have failed to do that. One last thing, the fact that tribalism could be an outcome of this process is something which is particularly the case, particularly a challenge to people like me and Wendy who emphasize civil society, because civil society is the home of tribalism. Liberalism, in large part, wanted to eliminate those aspects of our interactions, and one of the things that liberalism attempted to do was precisely to have society organized in a sufficiently anonymous way, except for families, so that the tribalism of the 17th century to which the great liberal philosophers were responding would not happen. It's also true that the positive motivations we have towards each other co-evolved with insider-outsider distinctions. I mean biologically co-evolved with a very warlike environment in which the societies which cooperated were the societies which won wars. And so, I mean, we have to face up to the fact that our better angels are also strongly associated with the rather worst part of our hostility and parochialism.
It ties together at something on the chat with what Sam said, and this is someone commenting that, and this is rather a long time ago now, I think 50 minutes in and nobody's mentioned race, but this is exactly the part of the model that where race and identity come in. So a very clear example in the COVID episode has related to wearing masks, and the fact that in some societies mask wearing is a social norm whenever you've got some sort of cough or cold, and that's helped in controlling the pandemic. But in other countries, the mask wearer is the outsider, is associated with somehow the Chinese virus, and there are notices on shops saying if you're wearing a mask you cannot enter. So that's where these considerations can be fitted into the sort of framework that we were trying to talk about.
I was actually going to come to race now, but maybe there's a sort of related question here to also, or maybe not related, but to immigration and the role that immigration plays into the question is explicitly that this is somehow the embracing immigration is part of the neoliberal model, but I presume it's also part of what you are when you think about your model. What role does immigration have in your model?
Well, I'll respond to that. We haven't articulated our policies in all of the dimensions of the model, but the commitments that Wendy and I have, and a great many people have, are to an open world society of free movement, both of ideas and people. But that doesn't mean open borders, obviously. I think there are very powerful moral arguments for opening up immigration in countries which are privileged with having valuable resources and the capacity to make a good living and so on. But I think those policies have to be developed in such a way that you preserve the opportunity for immigration in the future by having immigration that works today, so that you can sustain a democratic society which supports the admission of people who have every right to be admitted.
There is a question, sort of a general question, but it's the fact that this is from Gopal Sekar. He says, do you think now health has become an important economic factor? So, this emphasis on health and sort of physical well-being in a way, or mental well-being also, is that has so suddenly been brought out by the pandemic? How does that affect sort of your view of the world, or how does it, I think it has shaped our preferences somehow. Anyone want to come in on that?
Well, I think that, we were sort of alert to that, weren't we, with all the work that's been done on deaths of despair, and that the health inequality and the sources of health inequality were staring us in the face in many many economies way before the pandemic. But the pandemic has underscored the relationship between types of disadvantage and susceptibility to death. So I think the pandemic's brought up, pushed much up the agenda many issues that in different ways are concerned with health, and the question about who are essential workers, and the question about who was being forced to go to work in situations that were dangerous to their health, and these answers to these questions are sensitizing us, all of us, to have to think in much more ethical terms than we've become accustomed to, certainly as economists.
Yes, of course. I mean, you think about here in the UK, the NHS and the the obligation you have to go to work, even though equipment may be not sufficiently protective and so on. It's part of the contract, and it's we don't think about it in normal time. I wanted to, there's a question here about vaccine and treatment, and how that once vaccine hopefully becomes available, how it should be distributed is by Subidate Togan. But it sort of brings up a question. You look at now a lot at the sort of national level, but how does this shrinking capitalism look at the global level? And what is the balance between sort of market, state, and civil society? We know that the state at the global level is extremely weak. Markets are more effective. What's the role of the third dimension at the global level?
I think the vaccine conference today, I mean, I would just alert everyone to pay attention, because that's where it's playing out in real time. And it's an example of global mobilization with the intention of creating the production capability for the billions of units of vaccine that will be required, for that production to be distributed geographically, and for there to be a kind of orderly and ethically based allocation process. And it is a very interesting example, because the large pharmaceutical companies have stepped up under these extreme conditions to in a way that they're not intending to make massive profits from the vaccine. And there's extraordinary collaborations going on between pharmaceutical companies, universities, private laboratories, private companies, donors, and developing a coalition sufficient to mobilize the funds required from governments around the world. So, you know, watch that space for an example where we can see whether this can be successful. And it has to rely on civil society in many dimensions, but an important one is in creating the trust that vaccines are safe, and that people have to be vaccinated in order to confer benefits on others. And that's a powerful motivation. It's been the motivation for the success of vaccines in the past, and it's a challenge for all of us to make sure that's true this time as well.
So you're talking about Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and I think it is a very good illustration actually of this kind of, you need a triangle at least to understand how that works and the importance it has. Of course, what's happening today is that there is the replenishment of its funding today. So it's sort of the ultimate manifestation of the force of this triangle. Sam, you want to come in?
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges is the construction of a global civil society. I mean, obviously, national boundaries have huge salience in terms of who we regard as the us and who is the them, and so on. And sometimes people, and obviously, if civil society is going to have global reach, we have to develop bonds of respect, love, solidarity with people who are distant from us, complete strangers, and so on. Now, we sometimes despair because of the nationalistic tendencies in the world today. But I want to ask us now to think about nationalism as a wonderful example of what can be done. That is, the idea that something called Italy would exist. There was an Italian language, but there was no Italy. And it was nationalism that created a country of people who call themselves Italians and don't really from as being entirely other. Now, in other words, the creation among strangers of a sense of loyalty is something which we've seen happening on a massive scale, France, the United States, and so on. Now, you say, well, could that be extended globally? Well, we don't know if it could or not. But what we do know is that if you had been in the, say, 1800 and said, would you find the kinds of national identity that we observe in the world today in entities as large as France or Italy or the United States? Absolutely not. These are divided societies and so that I think our job should now be to try to extend that kind of unification, that personal unification to a global scale, so that the civil society can have the same kind of effect that it has domestically in some places. And we already see that in large measure. I mean, there are so many wonderful examples of cooperation on a very grand scale, entirely disrespecting any national boundaries. But it's a project to work on.
There's a question here that probably ties into something you said, Wendy, about centralization in the health industry. It's from Barnaby, Pizer, Pepin. If the allocation of resources should be determined more ethically rather than by market forces, then doesn't this correspond to the emphasis of centralization in the health industry? So how do you get an ethical, decentralized distribution of healthcare?
Well, I didn't, the sound was very bad, so I couldn't catch everything, but it's something to do with decentralization and...
Yeah, so what you said before, that it turned out that the UK model with a very strong centralization of the healthcare system didn't deliver in the pandemic. And the question here is, if the allocation of resources should happen in a more ethical way, how can you assure that if you have a sort of decentralized solution?
Yeah, so I think there are different aspects here, and some aspects of the centralization of the National Health Service worked extremely well. What didn't work well was the testing, and this comes up against what Philippe was emphasizing, as well as some of these dimensions that we find inside the triangle, which is that we need to find the complementarity between the what the state is good at, what the market is good at, and what civil society is good at. And it's when those things can be combined, then we get good outcomes. And the balance, the weighted balance between them is not going to be the same thing for a test and trace system, for example, and the laboratories, the organization of the laboratories, so or for innovation. So there's not a one size fits all. I think the argument is that we have a very rich field, a very rich space in which we can think of institutional arrangements, and it's being creative and making use of all three dimensions that's going to be part of solving these problems.
We have spoken about incomplete contracting. We have spoken a bit about behavioral. There's a question here from Alison Rankin Frost. So what can economics learn from neuroscience, behavioral science, and psychology? A broad question, but how does that play in? And maybe more generally, how should economics relate to other disciplines, given your sort of model of the world?
Well, I think there are a couple of things to say about that. First, economics has learned tremendously already from psychology. Some of our experiments about crowding out that Philippe mentioned, for example, that problem, they were the key experiments of those were done almost 50 years ago, the so-called theory of overdetermination in psychology. So economists are late in catching up in that area, but we have added very good experiments which have enriched the psychological literature. And we have also learned, for example, what are the psychological bases for the crowding out phenomenon and so on. But something more important, if contracts are incomplete, then you necessarily have to know sociology and psychology and political science to be a good economist. Here's why. If there's power and social norms as part of the contractual process, if that's part of how contracts now work, which is the exercise of power by the principal and the expression of social norms by both principal and agent, then the study of sociology and the study of psychology and the study of power, that is politics, are no longer something that's optional for an economist. If you want to understand how prices are set and wages are set, those become part of what you have to study. Now, of course, in the past, we say economists are narrow-minded. We're not interested in sociology. And somebody says, well, okay, you know, I'm not interested in the family. The sociologists can study that. I'm sorry, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if you want to understand economics, you have to know sociology now and psychology. And that's one of the things that Wendy and I are trying to do in our introductory course in economics, the so-called core project, which is to learn from the other disciplines what we have to know to be good economists.
Anyone else wants to come in on this? There's a question here from Christoph Avenarius. Could a more responsible civil society arise with the added conditionality of free health insurance coverage on the avoidance of mass contact? So I guess here trying to see how does it sort of the provision of healthcare and health insurance affect the COVID response. Philippe provided some data on that I thought was, maybe Philippe, you want to come in on this? Or
so your question, so what is it? So sorry, can you repeat your question? Let me make sure I don't misunderstand.
No, so the question is so the free health insurance is a way to get people to maybe behave more optimally in a pandemic. So if you, so the way we organize healthcare, how should we best organize it to respond in a pandemic?
Well, that's a huge, that's a huge question. It's clear that in the US, the fact that it was so costly to access healthcare discouraged. You had many workers who they just didn't go to be tested or to be cured, and they had to work. So the poverty combined with the absence of health support was certainly a factor that magnified the spreading, because you had a number of people who didn't get cured or tested or anything, and were still working because they needed to earn their living. And so the combination of the two, of course, was very bad. So you could see there how it would have made a difference already to have free health coverage and not have that depend on. Because you see, you could have also the very reactionary view, which is to say, if you, it's all about moral hazard, and if you protect people, they don't take care. That would be the ultra-conservative view. You see, to say that whenever you provide care, that's at the expense of responsibility. But that's it shows that it's not. No, that's not the case. It would have been much, and we know. And another example is the contrast between France and Germany. In France, because we were lacking respirators and tests, we had to confine in a very, top-down way, which in turn inhibited, social behavior. Had we been more lenient, and we could have been more lenient, particularly if we had more respirators, it would have, I think, it would have induced more, more social behavior. So that's
there's another question for you here, so which is related, I think. So, when you look at the data you showed, so, and this is from Yoni Ben Bassat, how did society contribute for these results apart from the government? And what was the role of the private sector? So we haven't spoken much about the private sector. We mentioned it in the connection with the vaccine initiative and so on. But when you look at those data, what explains the difference other than the role of the government?
So, Erik, is it the part on the social, or is it that part that you are questioning?
Well, you can take it. So the question is the data you showed. How did society contribute to these results?
No,
not the government.
Yeah. So I think if I look at the outsourcing results, what you see that is not only true in COVID products, France had a stagnant domestic production, and France outsourced more and more. Why did France outsource more and more? Because it's a way to escape the lack of social dialogue. I think a big part is that in Germany they had a true industrial policy, much more, they invested much more than in France. But I think another element is that you also have too many regulations in France, and also an absence of social dialogue, and therefore to escape conflict, French firms outsource more. In Germany, you can solve conflicts much better. So that's already an instance where the lack of social dialogue and makes a difference between France and Germany. So that's I think is interesting. On the trust, I didn't show the numbers, but the French government is one of the most distrusted European governments when it comes to COVID management. So it's very interesting. Everybody wanted some confinement. They wanted the lockdown because they thought that given the few number of respirators, it was the only way. But they kept distrusting their government, and so that's interesting compared to compared to other countries. Okay, I think we are running against the time limit here. So I think we have had some 40 questions, and I haven't been able to do justice to all of them. What we will do is that we will I will share all the questions with the panelists, and we can see if you can establish contact afterwards to answer some of these questions. I think we have had a discussion both of how we can use this new conceptual framework to understand existing institutions and differences across countries, and differences between national level and global level, and so on. But we also can use it to think about how we can make a better society, and particularly I think what is attractive is the fact that you can create a stronger ethical foundation for social institutions. So thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you to the audience. We are going to be back next week, Thursday afternoon, discussing central bank digital currencies and how they can be used in the COVID response with Benoit Couret and Christina Knowles-Siegel, among others. So tune in next week as well. Thank you very much, and be safe.
Thank you very much, Erik.